Welcome to a new episode of The Untold with you, Hayvi, Bouzo. And today we are joined by Victoria Coates, Senior Fellow at the Center for Security Policy and former Deputy National Security Advisor for Middle Eastern and North African Affairs. We're also joined by Khodorkovsky, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Digital Strategy and Senior Advisor to the U.S. Special Representative for Iran. I'm so delighted to have you both on the show today.
Thanks, Hayvi.
Thank you very much for including us.
You guys were part of a team that accomplished so many great things in foreign policy in the State Department. We've had so many accomplishments. I will start with the Abrahamic Accords, because this is something for me as someone who was born in the Middle East. It's definitely historical. And it's a dawn of an era that could tremendously change how the region functions. And it's very promising of security and prosperity for the people of that region that was tormented by wars. Can you tell me a little bit, as both of you were working on specifically these issues, I just want to hear your perspective as people who are working on these achievements. Let's start with Victoria.
Well, thank you. And as I said, thank you for including us. I always want to start with a big hello to all my friends in the Holy Land. We'll come through this and be together again. The Abraham Accords were really, I think, the crowning achievement from my perspective in terms of foreign policy for the Trump administration. And, you know, it was a collective effort. I think it's wonderful that Special Advisor, our Senior Advisor Kushner, Avi Berkowitz, Ambassador Friedman, and Ambassador Dermer have all been nominated for Nobel Peace Prizes, because they literally have brought peace. It is the most appropriate set of nominees I've ever seen. So hopefully they will get that due recognition. I think what really set up the Abraham Accords was a very direct sense of clarity from the administration from the earliest days that we were going to both stand unequivocally with our ally Israel. I think the steps that were taken from the move of the embassy to Jerusalem to the recognition of the Golan Heights, to some of the statements and policy changes on Judea and Samaria are clear indicators that the United States would no longer tolerate the kind of diplomatic niceties that had grown up around Israel's status, allowing a lot of countries to play a double game. And at the same time, being very clear with our Arab allies as well, that we valued their friendship. We wanted to strengthen those relationships. And, you know, by focusing on those policies, I think we gave both parties a great deal of confidence to take steps that they wouldn't have been comfortable taking under other circumstances. And, you know, as the common threat of Iran, which I know Len will talk about, became clearer and clearer, you know, they realized they had so much more in common than pulled them apart. And, you know, what had seemed like something we would do very slowly and incrementally even a year ago, suddenly just took on a momentum and life of its own. As you know, all of these Arab partners, as Israel realized, this is the path to a more prosperous and secure Middle East.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. First of all, with Victoria on the well-deserved recognition that you know, Jared Kushner, Avi Berkowitz, Ambassador Friedman, Ron Dermer, and a whole host of other people who were not specifically nominated, who were an integral part of creating the vision and the reality of a new Middle East. This is not something that could have been predicted, certainly not before the Trump administration, and even in the first couple of years of the Trump administration, even though this is something obviously we were hoping for and working toward, it was not a sure thing. So the breathtaking nature of the pace of all of these Abraham Accords are spectacular, and I think you know, it's a great example of what's possible when you apply creative thinking and deal in reality, and that's what we tried to do during the time that we served. You know, to deal in reality and truth on the ground. I would even say that, as Victoria alluded, Abraham Accords would probably not be possible without the American strategy on Iran. I think it took our pivot away from the previous administration to recognize the common threat that was facing Israel and our Arab partners in the region. That was the reality, and I think what it ended up doing is it rebuilt trust between all of those entities and the United States. And it's always a good place to start anything with this common ground of trust. When you trust somebody, you can make deal with somebody. When you trust somebody, you can invest in someone. And so I think what all of these countries ended up doing is, by virtue of finding that trust on the Iran issue, the central threat for all of the countries in the region, they found common ground and trusted relationships that could go beyond security, that could go into economic cooperation, cooperation in the tech sphere, healthcare, and so many more areas that are open to cooperation for all of the countries in the region. Which I guess brings me to what we're hoping would follow Abraham Accords, and that's Cyrus Accords. Cyrus Accords is the article that Victoria and I just wrote.
Yes.
And the beautiful thing about Cyrus Accords is, contrary to the conventional wisdom that Israel and Iran can never be friends, it is the polar opposite. The relationship between the people of Iran and the people of Israel, Jewish people and the people of Persian heritage, goes way back to Cyrus the Great. And we think that that is the future of the region as well. So not only will all of Abraham's descendants find common ground, but the descendants of Abraham and descendants of Cyrus will find common ground sooner rather than later.
And I wanted to go there, actually. So you did co-write an op-ed at the Jerusalem Post asking the question, is peace between Iran and Israel inevitable? And when somebody reads this right now, knowing that we have a Biden administration in the White House, that the Iranian regime is still there, who are you talking about here? But once you read it, you realize that you both are talking about the people, and specifically the historical aspect of the alliance between the Persians and the Jewish people historically. Why are you so optimistic? When I read the article, it just gives me that kind of sense of, yes, it's gonna happen. But what are you relying on, knowing that we don't have the Trump administration in the White House, which actually carried out all of these policies that the Iranian regime usually responds to these specific types of, strong, credible threats, actually having sanctions. So tell me more about why you chose to write this right now.
Well, from my part, Len and I are taking a historical perspective which transcends individual American administrations. And I think, we've seen a very close, vital relationship between Israel and the United States go through different phases with different Israeli administrations, different American administrations. We're both democracies. That is inevitable. And as Len said, we tried to deal with reality, but certainly encourage our successors to do the same. And look at the actions of the Iranian regime over the last couple of weeks. They're the ones who have rejected the notion of expanded talks. They're the ones who are increasing enrichment and taking other provocative actions. And so I think, hopefully they will see the Iranian regime for what it is. And one other point that I think would perhaps lead us to think this might happen sooner rather than later is, in June, we will have another Iranian presidential election. And if you cast your mind back to not too long ago, to 2009, to the early days of the Obama administration, I have heard President Obama say it was a mistake not to stand with the Iranian people when, in the Green Revolution, after the fraudulent presidential election, they flooded into the streets waving American flags, signs calling for Obama to support them. And, that was a great opportunity for the United States to take peaceful steps to support the Iranian people. And one of the things, we would encourage in what would set the foundation for the Cyrus Accords would be reach out to the Iranian people, help them with communications, with free internet access, with encryption tools that will protect their identities so they can communicate. That's not a provocative act of war. That is simply a gift to the Iranian people. And by engaging in that kind of activity, I think, if there is ongoing dissatisfaction with the way their republic is dominated by, a very small group of extreme ideological theocrats, and that they do want a freer and fairer and more prosperous future, potentially in partnership with Israel, this is a really key moment for us to support that.
Lynn, you started with a little bit about this, but in your opinion, how realistic it is to expect from the Biden administration to actually make those steps that Victoria was just talking about in terms of showing an actual support for the Iranian people? Today, there was a letter published online by Iranian activists who are inside of Iran today with their name signed at the bottom, asking President Biden not to lift sanctions on the Iranian regime. So these people are that courageous. They're inside of Iran. They know they might get executed for this, but they are asking the United States not to lift the sanctions, which is something that a lot of people are concerned about.
Well, it's not in the American national security interest to go back in time. 2021 is not 2015. Even 2015 wasn't 2015 for many of us. But it's certainly a long way from there, and a whole lot of experience has been accumulated for all of these years. Everyone could see, number one, that a lot of people who were preaching conventional wisdom were wrong. The engagement between the United States and other free world nations and entities and the Iranian people has blossomed. Not to the full extent that it should, but it certainly has grown. And an important part of why it's grown is the trust. The trust that Iranian people were able to see from the American government that spoke the truth, spoke to them honestly, even in the face of the regime's propaganda about our sanctions being aimed at the people. The people knew very well that, number one, we had humanitarian exceptions and sanctions. Number two, they knew very well that the regime does not use the funds in its treasury to improve the lives of Iranians. They haven't done it in 42 years, and they're not doing it now. They didn't do it before sanctions. They didn't do it during JCPOA, after JCPOA, or today. The only reason the regime is contemplating discussing any issue with the Biden administration is to get cash, not to improve the lives of the Iranian people, not to make strides toward a more peaceful world and better cooperation with their neighbors, but to refill their pockets so that they can keep doing what they've been doing for 42 years, which is pursue a nuclear weapon, pursue terrorism in the region, pursue human rights abuses and suppress their own citizens, and create death and destruction around the world, assassinating dissidents, not just in their own country, which is deplorable enough, but in other countries, which is why so many different countries have expelled Iranian diplomats. They have outlawed various organizations that have to do with that support Iranian terrorism. And the first people who see this close up are the Iranian people themselves. They don't need the United States or anybody else to tell them about their oppressive regime. So hopefully the Biden administration has learned in the last few years what the reality on the ground is, that the people in Iran want the same rights that every other free human being wants anywhere else in the world. And that their government is not interested in addressing serious issues that must be addressed in order for the world's top state sponsor of terrorism to fit into the community of nations. So hopefully, there are smart people in the Biden administration who are capable of all of this analysis, and hopefully sobriety will prevail, and the administration sees the world as it is, not the way John Kerry saw it in 2015.
And Javi, if I could just thank you for raising that letter. I saw it yesterday. It's an extraordinary statement of courage, as you said, for these individuals, and there are a long number of them, to all sign that personally. And I think that that is a profound signal that the kind of disinformation campaign that the leadership in Tehran have engaged in, that the opposition in Iran is fractured, that the main concern of the Iranian people is stability, that there is still a reservoir of respect and affection for the supreme leader. This is their propaganda machine at work. And it's why it's so important for us to, engage with the media and tell the truth as aggressively as they lie. And the truth is in that letter. There are brave, committed Iranian patriots who see what is possible for their country and who are willing to put their names out there. And so I think as we are in this very charged period leading up to the June elections, hopefully the Biden administration will take that as the gesture that it is and ramp up their support. Also important to remember, the executive branch is not the only branch of the United States government. And there is very strong bipartisan support for the Iranian people in the US Congress, both in the Senate and in the House. And I think for the sorts of things that Len and I are proposing, you could see a lot of congressional interest in that. The American people understand this viscerally. They remember 1979. They remember the hostage taking. They've watched Iran since then. They know this regime is not our friend, and they would be supportive of their representatives in Congress, in turn being supportive of the Iranian people to get to a more prosperous, peaceful, stable Middle East.
As you said about the importance of media, we saw an interview with Jawad Zarif yesterday with Christian Amanpour that seemed to be a very soft interview, knowing that what this regime has been committing. I mean, there are atrocities that are being committed by this regime and continue to be committed. So in your opinion, what type of message should the American government in its totality be sending these people today, giving this new letter that was signed?
Number one, the same way that that we saw the lessons of the Obama administration's failure to support the Iranian people in 2009. One of the first things that we did when we had the opportunity to do this in the administration was to be clear that we support and stand with the Iranian people. We did not mince words. We made very plain the difference between the regime and the Iranian people. And to the extent that we could, we took steps toward trying to create a reality on the ground that would serve as a foundation for a more open, a freer Iran, where the government supports and works toward the benefit of its people and respects its people and doesn't commit massacres of 1,500 people on the street who are simply asking to be treated fairly. That is what the Iranian people want, and I think the number one job of not just the American government, but any free country is to stand with people who are expressing their wish, their hope to be free as well, to have their human rights respected. So number one, I think be clear that you understand the difference between the Iranian people and the government. Call out the perpetrators of human rights abuses. Call out the hostage taking, the continuing hostage taking that is taking place to this day. The regime was born from taking 52 Americans hostage, and it continues to take not just Americans, but others hostage as well. That is outrageous. That is not a partner that should be treated like Javad Zarif was treated in years past and during the interview that you're referring to. The other thing is, fortunately, reporters, no offense, but reporters don't make policy. The government makes policy, and so you know, as soft as the interview that Ms. Amanpour conducted, Ms. Amanpour is not in charge of the United States policy. So I would say it's important for people that are in place because of the will of the American people, who have accountability to the American people, to make those decisions and to make them in good faith and recognize the reality on the ground. One obvious thing to recognize is that Jawad Zarif is no moderate. Neither he nor President Rouhani nor any of the other purported moderates who are positioned to be somehow more sensible than the supreme leader. Everybody in the Iranian government is selected by the supreme leader and is accountable to him and him only. So that is that is something that's important for the public to understand. The Iranian people get it. It's important that the American people and people in other free countries understand that as well. And only when we recognize the reality on the ground will we be able to make progress and defang the chief menace of the Middle East, the Islamic Republic of Iran.
On the Zarif issue, you know, there's a cottage industry of folks who he uses as his Western mouthpieces. And, you know, my favorite is, you know, he gets to use Twitter, the supreme leader gets to use Twitter, Rouhani gets to use Twitter, but the Iranian people don't get to use Twitter. And I think we should see Zarif for what he is, the chief propaganda minister for the West of the regime. And it is unfortunate that a whole host of Western journalists, this isn't to single out Christiane Amanpour, but certainly, I mean, as someone who repeatedly declares her allegiance to the free press and to telling the truth, for her to not understand that she is being fed the very well thought out and crafted official propaganda disinformation campaign of the Iranian regime is really unfortunate. And so, as I said earlier, you know, it is our burden on us to tell the truth as aggressively as they lie. And so one reason we appreciate having this time with you today, but I think it's something all of us, you know, across the US government who care about this issue need to be outspoken.
So this is a very important issue that you both touched on, which is the distinction between, you know, the so-called reformists in the Iranian regime and Khamenei, who is the actual ruler. And this brings us, I mean, you know, to kind of how the coverage of some channels, they try to kind of go along with this game by the Iranian regime, that there is the Jawad Zarif, Rouhani, who are reformists, quote unquote, which is echoing exactly the Obama administration's approach to the Iranian regime and how we saw the whole JCPOA was prioritized and that was the direction. And so when we look today at the Biden administration, there are some people who are hoping that the Biden administration is not an Obama 2.0, that this is a more and less isolationist, that the views of Biden and probably Kamala Harris are different than Obama and his views on the United States positioning in the world. However, there are some appointees that were put in place that made people concerned. For example, Robertnelly. So I wanted to hear your opinion on these people who are now in the State Department, who were involved in making the first JCPOA, and why people are now concerned about this same kind of approach to the Iranian regime that is basically exposed. And I mean, the people know that who rules Iran is Khamenei and nobody else.
Starting with your original question on reformists versus extremists, name one policy that the Iranian government has implemented that didn't get the blessing of Khamenei. It doesn't happen. There's one person in charge. Any illusion about negotiating beyond the scope of what Khamenei and decides is on the table doesn't exist. So there's plenty of lip service given by Zarif and other apologists for the regime about trying to thread the needle and find the unicorn in the Iranian government that somehow is going to miraculously figure out a way to trick the supreme leader into something that he's not prepared to do. But that's that's not likely. The return to that approach is foolish. Certainly we will judge all the appointees, including those you mentioned, Robertnelly and company, by their actions. Again, I would just underscore that 2021 is not 2015. And hopefully those people in place from the Obama administration are capable of evolving as well and deal in reality, because that is the only way that we can succeed in what everybody recognizes as the necessity to, number one, never allow the Iranian regime to attain a nuclear weapon. Number two, to box them in and stop the regime from metastasizing across the region and disrupting the lives of not just Iranians, but all of its neighbors and people on 5 continents around the world. I believe at some point when we served, I came across a stat that since 1979, Iran attempted assassinations on 5 continents around the world. That doesn't seem to me like a government that's ready to coexist in the community of nations. That is extremely sociopathic behavior that needs to be addressed. And while everybody pays lip service to that, I think the proof is in the pudding, and we'll see what the Biden administration and its appointees do to deal in this sobering reality. That's the only way that we will ever solve this issue, and hopefully one day reach a point where Israel, Iran, the United States, and everybody else can live in peace and harmony after signing the Cyrus Accords. That was my shameless plug.
It was a good one, Len. I would just add really quickly on Rouhani. If he's a reformist, he's a miserable failure, because elected to purportedly reform the Iranian economy, given all of the resources that flowed into the country under the JCPOA, the fact that there have been no economic reforms, even before the president ceased US participation in the deal in May of 2018. I mean, they had years in there to start investing that money to attract foreign direct investment. They did none of that. Instead, they poured the money into, as Len said, regional intervention. And look at the places that Iran has intervened. You're looking at Lebanon, you're looking at Syria, you're looking at Yemen, some of the most tragic, broken states in the Middle East, all because of Iranian intervention. That's what their friendship looks like. And there can be no debate on that. That's not an accident. And you look at the places that the United States has supported, first and foremost, Israel. You see a thriving democracy that is leading the region, engaging its neighbors, contributing to security and prosperity. The contrast couldn't be more clear. And so as you look at this regime and you try to think how you might want to engage with it, I think that reality has to be taken very clearly into account.
Let's go to the Iran nuclear question, because this is the issue where now we're hearing comments about the Iranian regime is only a few weeks away from having a nuclear weapon. This is very dangerous. The Iranian regime itself would say things like a week, which is not something that people are believing, but it's very concerning. So in your opinion, what is the solution to this very big problem, and what is the right approach to handle this issue? I mean, people like me who have been covering the region for so long, I can't not think that if we really want to prevent this regime from obtaining a nuclear weapon, we have to look at what happened to North Korea and how there was negotiations and North Korea ended up with a nuclear weapon. Why not consider a military solution to that problem? And I know this is something that a lot of people find unattractive. They don't like to hear this, but if we don't want to have a nuclear Middle East where a lot of other countries coming up with their own nuclear weapons, why don't we actually make sure that this regime does not get a nuclear weapon, which is very, very dangerous for our allies and for the security of the world?
Well, I would just say, President Trump was always very clear that Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon was his red line, that all options were on the table to counter that. When he saw an intolerable threat to the United States, particularly from Qasem Soleimani, he demonstrated the fact that he was willing to take very direct kinetic action to counter that threat. And I think, as you say very rightly, the North Korea example has to loom large in everybody's minds, that this was with failed negotiation. They tricked us repeatedly and emerged with a weapon because that was always their intent. And I think for me, having spent a lot of time in Abu Dhabi over the summer, working particularly on the startup of their Baraka civil nuclear plant, there is a path to civil nuclear power for countries in the Middle East. It goes through the United States, through a 123 agreement, which has all sorts of security protocols, through partnership with us. Our national labs stand by, ready and willing to partner on everything from cybersecurity to technical assistance. And we want to support that for our Middle East partners and allies. Had Iran actually wished to pursue a civilian nuclear program, that path was open to them. They chose not to. So I think their intent is clear. We can't pretend, as they did in 2015, that this was some sort of peaceful program. Certainly the revelation of the archives that Israel was obviously central in publishing about their nuclear program, about the Ahmad program. We know what they want. And the question is, is this administration, is President Biden willing, as President Trump was, to say that Iran will not get a nuclear weapon on his watch? Or would he rather engage in the kind of diplomatic dance that was executed, that's the wrong word, but was danced by the Clinton administration with North Korea, and leave his successors in a similarly difficult spot?
The concern is that we're talking here about when we hear weeks. I mean, it doesn't seem there's a lot of time on our hands at this point. So what is the approach in your opinion? And what do you think of that suggestion when people talk about an actual military solution where there's airstrikes targeting this nuclear project that is very dangerous for everybody in the Middle East?
Well, I would let people more qualified than me to talk about military solutions. But what I can say is, let's take a look at what's happening with this accumulation of a stockpile of uranium, and essentially, look, they're just because they've increased the amount of uranium doesn't mean they're ready for a nuclear weapon. Let's just make sure we're dealing with reality. So yes, it's troubling. We're going in the wrong direction, but we're not close to a nuclear Iran quite yet. However, what this illustrates is exactly the problem with JCPOA. So if you look at Iran today, their economy is in shambles. They don't have as much money to send to their proxies around the region. There is a pandemic in Iran that that they have to deal with, and are not dealing with it successfully at all. In fact, if I could digress, at the time when everybody was shutting down their borders and people were finding out that there's something awful going on in China, in Wuhan specifically, in February of this year, Mahan Air flights were continuing between China and Iran. 55 of them reportedly in the month of February. And so, if the people in Iran are looking for the culprit of why the COVID epidemic in Iran is a mess, they can start with asking their government questions why they continued to transport people between China and Iran for the entire month of February. Not just that, I think it's safe to assume that a lot of those continuing flights, whether it's Mahan Air flights or any other Iranian flights, landed in other countries. And so who knows? Who knows what role Iran played in spreading the pandemic? But getting back to the nuclear issue, the idea that Iran today, which is tinkering with provoking the international community with its enrichment, would be in a position 15 years after JCPOA was agreed upon to do exactly the same the next day, except now much richer, much more military, stocked militarily, much more aggressive, and for all intents and purposes, with the legal ability to do what they've been doing for 42 years, because that's the path that JCPOA paved for this regime. Would we rather be dealing with the situation today when Iran is boxed in and is desperate for cash, or would we have rather dealt with it in a few years' time when the floodgates would have been opened and Iran could do exactly what it's doing today, except unencumbered by any sanctions? So, this is something the Biden administration needs to think long and hard about. It underscores the foolishness of contemplating going back to the 2015 version of JCPOA, which is irreparably flawed in so many ways, and it doesn't make any sense. So I think let's deal in reality. Let's not fall for the games that Iranian regime is trying to play again. The supreme leader has already stated he's not interested in negotiating anything beyond the JCPOA agreement, which is a pretty good deal for him and IRGC and the regime in power. So I can understand that that's his position, but that doesn't mean that we need to go through that again. And we all learn from that experience, and hopefully the Biden administration can assess it in a sober way and move on in a way that makes sense for American national interest and the regional interests.
I actually think you mentioned something important, Lynn, which is an intro to our next focus here, which is the pandemic. I called it the Wuhan virus as well, the Chinese virus. It came from China. As you mentioned, in Iran, the Iranian regime having those close ties to the Chinese regime, there was a widespread of the pandemic, and the Iranian regime declined the aid that was offered by the United States for the Iranian people, while continuing to have their direct flights to China. And that shows the priorities of this regime. So the China policy, I mean, definitely the Trump administration was the first American administration to stand up to China. Many violations of law, so many violations of international treaties, and stealing American and Western technology. So there's history there, but we haven't seen any other American administration make the decision to confront China on all of these things. Now the Chinese Communist Party is promising the Iranian regime to support. There is some military deals that they were signed, I believe, between both regimes. So what is the prospect, in your opinion, about this upcoming probably support, where the Chinese Communist Party is going to be supporting the Islamic regime in Iran that is terrorizing the region?
I think that is a generational question for us, is how we're going to manage this. Quite frankly, the failure on China over the last 20 years has been 30 years, really, since 1989, has been a profoundly bipartisan one. I think the assumption after Tiananmen Square was, especially with the Cold War coming to a close, the wall coming down, that all we had to do was wait, and China would follow the same inevitable path to economic or to political liberalization, especially if we engaged in economic liberalization. And for a time, I think that looked like it might be coming true, but certainly under President Xi, China has taken a reverse track, and we now have the equivalent of an alarm having been sounded with, as you very accurately put it, the Wuhan virus. If we're going to refer to the British strain and the South African strain, certainly we can refer to the geographic origins of this virus. And if you think back to the late 1930s, when Winston Churchill published his seminal book, While England Slept, warning of the rise of Nazi Germany, I think we've all been, in a way, peacefully asleep on the China issue. The alarm has been sounded. We know now. We know what they're capable of. We know what they've done to the world. There can be no question. And you look at something like the Iran case here, where the regime is so beholden to their Chinese masters for economic support that they will do anything, including risk the health and safety of their own citizens. And I'd love to see a poll of the Iranian people about if they were offered a Chinese vaccination or a US or European vaccination, which they'd pick. I think that would be a pretty revealing question to ask. And, we don't know what the safety protocols are around the Chinese vaccines, because they certainly have not been transparent in their process. And, our enormous success with the production of vaccines, hopefully we'll get to the same spot in the administration of the vaccines that Israel has. But we should be the partner of choice, and that should be writ large for the region. We need to provide options to the region in terms of industrial support, in terms of technology support and engagement, in terms of security. China can't be a default partner. And all of our friends, and we've had many conversations with our Israeli colleagues over the last 4 years, and the conversations we were having at the end of 2020 were radically different from the conversations we were having at the beginning of 2017, when China was not seen as an issue in our bilateral relationship. It's now a central issue, and helping provide, as I said, alternatives for everything from 5G to desalination, to all of these areas that were not critical national security concerns previously, communications, water, that kind of thing, but now they are. And it is certainly my goal to continue to prioritize this issue and to, as I said, be a bridge, be a source of options to make sure all of our regional friends, first and foremost Israel, can be trusted partners going forward, unencumbered by malicious Chinese technology.
Absolutely. What do you think?
I couldn't agree more. China is the existential threat for so many in the world. It is there was the world before COVID, and then there's the world after COVID. And while we could afford to be asleep, I'm not even sure if we could afford it, but we just were. If we before the pandemic, and what everybody's recognizing to be the reality today is that Chinese government has been, at the very least, in an economic war with the rest of the free world, seeking dominance, seeking to supplant the United States and the free world as the predominant power. And we just conveniently took what we thought were all the benefits of doing business with China and forgot about all the liabilities. And what we're seeing today is, so many countries, companies, and individuals are recognizing that perhaps it wasn't worth it. It wasn't worth it to put all of our critical industries into the China basket, that perhaps we should start expanding our supply chains, especially when it comes to these critical sectors like healthcare, technology, transportation, infrastructure, you name it. To bring it back to Iran, there was some talk of this 25-year deal that China and Iran were going to strike, to help the Iranian government build up its infrastructure. Look, there are plenty of examples today of what China's, as one Southeast Asian foreign minister calls it, one belt, one-way toll road to Beijing, provides to its partners. And that is a loss of sovereignty, endless debt that some of these countries can never get out from under. And basically a surrender to a communist regime that is not interested in being a partner. They're interested in taking over. One of the things that we worked on at the State Department was to secure the area of 5G and communication services, because 5G is going to be the backbone of not just cell phones, but it's going to be the backbone of the economy. It's going to touch everything you touch in your everyday life, from your refrigerator to your car to certainly your phones and your airplanes and the military that protects us. So I think everybody needs to wake up and realize that the issue of surrendering the technological sector to the Communist Chinese government has implications way beyond smartphones, which is why so many countries have gravitated toward the initiative that we started called the Clean Network, which started out with just one partner, and that being us, the United States, and has in 1 year grown to about 60 countries and dozens and dozens of other companies like Oracle and Cisco and Fujitsu, NEC, market leaders in so many industries, including about 200 telecommunications companies. Look, I mean, when we started in January of 2020, Huawei announced about 91 contracts around the world. By the time of January 2021, they're down to about a dozen outside of China. And that is because all of these countries and companies that have entered into contracts with a tool of Chinese surveillance state have recognized the danger of surrendering their sovereignty and their intellectual property and their citizens' privacy, all of these things, to an entity like the Chinese Communist Party. So I think the corner has been turned, but the threat is still prevalent. It is embedded in so many things that we do, in our financial markets, in our technology, in every conceivable area of our existence, education, healthcare, you name it. And so it is something that all of us need to be vigilant about. Not just vigilant, I think there's something we need to do about it. And we've started doing something about it in the Trump administration, and the Biden administration and the rest of the world needs to now, once again, deal in reality and look at China, as Secretary Pompeo used to say, not with rose-colored glasses, but with clear eyes. And that is incumbent on all of us. And the people of Iran need to know that when they're entering into some sort of a deal with the Communist Chinese, they're surrendering their sovereignty and their precious resources to an entity that will never partner with them on equal terms.
And I mean, we see the people in Iran, we see all the videos of when there's the Iranian regime puts the American flag on the floor, they jump around it. And the same thing with the Israeli flag. They understand that the alliances that they actually have is with democracies, it's with the United States and Israel. And that's what they are hoping, where they actually look forward to partner in the future. But when we talk about the issues that you just mentioned in terms of the Chinese Communist Party, you also want to talk about another dimension, is that this party, the Communist Party, it's actually committing genocide against its Muslim population, specifically the Uyghurs, but also other Muslim minorities and Christians. We've seen throughout the years, there was the demolishing of churches. We've seen harassments and things that happen to Muslims who are in other areas, but now there is a genocide that's being committed against the Uyghurs and their whole region. And this is what, like, I think kind of like people want to connect it to the fact that the Chinese Communist Party now is trying to come in to support an Islamic regime while it's killing its own Muslim population. So, I mean, what do you think the response should be on the human rights violation by this regime against its own people, those defenseless people? And we're talking about 1 million of the Uyghurs, this minority in concentration camps.
I mean, I think this is an area where we should be unequivocal in standing with these oppressed minorities. You know, the United States has a history of being the world leader on human rights. There is no reason to cede that moral high ground for a moment to these people. As you said, they've got millions of people
in concentration camps. I think it demonstrates how very un-Islamic the Islamic Republic truly is. They have no interest in their Uyghur brothers and shining a light on what's happening to them. I think that is an area where we have done a lot. And I think certainly Len, working with Secretary Pompeo, was at the front of that effort. We can always do more. And my hope would be this would grow to be a bipartisan effort, that we can see this as a key component of what will also include, an economic and energy element as we marshal all of our resources and all of our friends to point out to China that they can't have it both ways anymore. If they want to participate in the global economic system, in the institutions that have made all of us very prosperous and can make us secure, then they're going to have to play by the rules. And if they won't play by the rules, they don't get included. And that's just going to have to be a very basic question we ask all of our friends.
It reminds me, maybe a few months ago, Brian Hook and Keith Kroc, who was the Undersecretary of State for Economic Growth, actually co-wrote an op-ed called Totalitarian Twins. It actually, it was probably around the time that the China-Iran deal was being talked about. And while their systems are vastly different, one is communist, one is extremist theological dictatorship. What they do have in common is an utter disrespect for their people. So yes, their atrocities are happening to the Muslim minority groups in Xinjiang, China. It is an embarrassment of our time that once again the world has to witness millions of people herded into concentration camps, forced into labor, and not holding the perpetrator of these abuses accountable and treating them just as another neutral party on the world stage. It's outrageous. It's another one of those areas that the world needs to wake up and own up to. It's not good enough to look at China as just one big marketplace. It's important to analyze it for all the warts that come with it. And a genocide of a people is quite a big obstacle that should be that should be addressed before anyone invests in China. They should be asked, are they okay with this? When they when they put China around the table to negotiate any self-respecting deal of any sort, they should ask themselves, are they okay with perpetrating a genocide? China has to explain itself. But look, the regime in Iran doesn't really care about the genocide of Muslims in China because it's perpetrating, a genocide of its own people. It's been doing it for 42 years. And so I could see where that topic would not come up in the talks between the Chinese and the Iranian dictators. So, but the truth of the matter is, that is something that is part of reality. The Biden administration and everybody else needs to make it a priority, because if we're going to call ourselves humanitarians, we need to address issues like this, which treat people like subhumans, and regardless of their religion, regardless of their background, regardless of where they are. It is a genocide in our time, and I'm glad Victoria brought up Churchill, who saw the brewing storm before World War II, and and how the world sat back and watched that develop and punted it down the road. Comparing anybody to the Nazi regime of the 30s and 40s is a high bar, but I think we need to wake up and assess what is going on in relation to China and its treatment of its own people and everybody else that it comes in contact with. So, it's not a very hopeful note to have to discuss, but it is reality, and that's how we have to look at the world.
I want to thank you so much both for this amazing discussion, very important discussion, very important topics. And I hope for more people to be inquiring about this, to be asking these very important questions. And we are looking forward to see the Biden administration succeed in carrying on and continuing a lot of many successes of the Trump administration that you guys were part of. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Hayvi.
having us, Hayvi.
Yeah, really great. Hope you'll have us back sometime.
Thank you all for listening and watching. With you, Hayvi and The Untold, and I'll see you next time.